The Oscar-winning American actor Gene Hackman, along with his wife Betsy, have been found dead in their home in New Mexico in the United States. This is breaking news. Details are still scarce. Police are saying that this is currently an active investigation, but they don't believe that there was foul play as being a factor in the deaths of these two people.
I'm not big on legends and that kind of thing. I would like to be remembered as a good actor.
Some actors don't just appear in a movie, they haunt it. The performance feels so real, so unguarded, that you forget the cameras exist and lean in, half convinced you're watching a man being pulled apart from the inside. Gene Hackman was that actor. For 4 decades, he was the reason other actors studied their craft. The working man's genius, the anti-star who turned down glamour, and the 2-time Oscar winner who seemed to shrink from the very fame that adored him. He played the American cop, the American tough, and the American failure and hero with so much gravity that he became less an actor than a national conscience on film. And then, quietly, he vanished. Not in a scandal, not in headlines, just the slow disappearance of a man who had decided he was done. No farewell tour, no retrospective, no final speech. Only silence, decades of it, broken by the occasional sighting of an old man in a pulled-down baseball cap strolling through a small city in New Mexico, looking like anyone's grandfather. Then, in February of 2025, the silence broke. Not with an announcement, not with a tribute, but with a discovery that stopped the world. Inside that quiet Santa Fe home, where 2 people had lived and loved and kept their lives so private that the world had almost forgotten them, authorities found something no one was prepared for. And what happened to that house, to the most celebrated actor of his generation and the woman beside him, and to the fortune they left behind, would become one of the most haunting questions in the modern history of Hollywood. This is not a story about a famous man dying. It's about what really happened in the last weeks of his life, and about what an $80 million fortune can and cannot buy when the lights go out. Stay with us, because before we get to what they found, we need to understand who Gene Hackman was and why a man with everything built a life that looked so much like a fortress. So what exactly happened inside that Santa Fe house? We'll answer it. But the answer, like the man, is not simple. It is a story with more than one ending, more than one body, more than one fortune, and more than one version of the truth. And before we can understand the fall, we need to meet the boy who was abandoned before he ever learned to walk tall. Gene Hackman was born on January 30th, 1930, in San Bernardino, California, a dusty railroad town east of Los Angeles where the desert meets the American myth of reinvention. His father, Eugene Ezra Hackman, ran the printing press at the local newspaper. His mother, Lyda, was a waitress. They were working people, ordinary in the deepest sense, except for one thing. The instability was always there. When Gene was 13, his father left, just packed up and walked out of his life. A teenager was left in the house with his mother and grandmother in the shadow of a man who had decided he did not want to be there anymore. Gene would later call that abandonment the defining wound of his life, the scar that shaped every part he ever played. It is one of the quieter ironies of cinema that the actor who became a symbol of American male toughness, the cop, the cowboy, the iron jaw, was forged by that loss. His mother, struggling under the weight of what she had been handed, turned to drinking, and years later she was gone too, killed in an accidental fire at her home in 1962 when Gene was in his early 30s. The 2 people who were supposed to hold his world together were both taken from him, one who chose to leave and one he could not save. What does that do to a boy? The answer to that question would become the silent engine of one of the most remarkable careers in the history of acting. But Hackman did not know yet that he would act. He only knew the house, the town, and the waiting to be raised had become unbearable. So he did what the abandoned do when the world feels too heavy. He ran towards something bigger. At 16, lying about his age, he left home and joined the United States Marine Corps. He served 4.5 years as a field radio operator stationed in China, then in Hawaii and Japan. He was trained, hardened, and given a structure his childhood never offered. And when he left the Corps in 1951, he carried a discipline that would stay with him his whole life. But discipline is not the same as direction. After the service, he drifted. He went to the University of Illinois, studying journalism and television production, hoping the stories he had lived could become something. The academic life did not hold him. And there is a moment in everyone's life, usually unremarkable at the time, where a door opens and a future walks through. For Hackman, it happened in a classroom at the Pasadena Playhouse in California, where a failure would define him more than any triumph. In the 1950s, he trained at the Pasadena Playhouse, the storied acting school, and there he met a young actor who would become a lifelong friend and rival, Dustin Hoffman. According to the famous story, the two of them were voted least likely to make it in the business. Too ordinary, too unremarkable, too short on the matinee idol looks Hollywood demanded. Gene Hackman and Dustin Hoffman, the least likely to succeed. Have you ever been told, by a teacher, a parent, or an employer, that you did not have it? Tell us in the comments, because that is where this story truly begins. Everything Hackman built, he built against that verdict. For years he worked in the theater, in New York, doing whatever paid the rent, auditioning the way the abandoned audition, and learning that rejection is not a verdict but a frequency. He met a woman named Faye Maltese. They married in 1956 and had 3 children, Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie. The family he had lost as a boy, he tried to rebuild as a man. But the struggle to become an actor ate at everything, including the marriage. And Hollywood had no use for him yet. Too ordinary, they said. Not a leading man. Not enough charisma. The industry had judged him unworthy, just as the teacher had. And the lesson of his whole life was that Gene Hackman did not know how to quit. So he kept going, and the world was about to crack open. The role that changed everything arrived in 1967, in a film that would be studied and argued over for the rest of his life. Bonnie and Clyde. Hackman played Buck Barrow, the awkward, desperate older brother. Not the lead, not the showy part, but something in his naturalness, his ability to be entirely ordinary and entirely riveting, made the audience. The Academy noticed, and in 1968 he received his first Oscar nomination. Then came the film that sealed his legend. In 1971, Hackman played Jimmy Popeye Doyle, the profane, obsessive New York narcotics detective in William Friedkin's The French Connection. The role required him to chase a subway train on foot through the streets of New York. It was raw, unglamorous, violent, and utterly compelling. And it won him his first Oscar for Best Actor. The teacher who said he would never make it would never know, but the world now did. But this is the part of the story the fortune and the fame do not prepare anyone for. When you reach the summit that mocked you, you have to decide what the summit is for. And Gene Hackman, as it turned out, was not interested in the summit at all. There is a particular cruelty in how fame works. It rewards you most for the things that make you feel safest. It wants you known, photographed, present, and celebrated. And Hackman had spent his life learning that the only way to feel safe was to stay small, unseen, and ordinary. He spent the next 3 decades winning the Oscars and the nominations and one of the most celebrated careers in American film, The Conversation, Superman, where he made the villain a comic masterpiece, Unforgiven, which won him a second Oscar, Mississippi Burning, The Firm, Crimson Tide, Enemy of the State, and The Royal Tenenbaums. The roles came, the honors came, and with every one he tried harder to disappear. He hated the press, the interviews, the parties, and the palaces. He decided, early on, that his work was his legacy and his privacy was his life, and he enforced it with an iron discipline that surprised even his friends. He bought a home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and quietly built a world around the family he had chosen. His second wife, Betsy Arakawa, was not an actress. She was a concert pianist, classical, serious, and private, everything the Hollywood machine was not, and she became the center of the most guarded part of his existence. In Santa Fe, away from the cameras, he built the one thing the abandoned boy had never had, a life that no one could leave him. Here is a question worth sitting with. Would you trade your privacy, your peace, your ordinary days for a fortune the world could see? Hackman made the opposite choice. He walked away from the center of the world while he was still at the top. In 2004, after one final film, he retired. No announcement, no farewell tour, just a quiet, total stop. He gave interviews only in glimpses and spent his days writing, reading, driving, walking, and being a man rather than a star. He had, in his own mind, beaten the machine. He had taken the money, the Oscars, and the reputation, and walked out with his soul intact. But the world does not always let a man go so easily. The price of that retreat, the cost of choosing the ordinary over the spectacle, would not be paid until the very end. In February of 2025, a maintenance worker arrived at a quiet home in the Sunset Trail area of Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was a routine visit, the kind that is supposed to be unremarkable. But the home had not been touched in days. No answer at the door. The silence was wrong. And when the worker looked in, he saw something that turned a routine errand into a police call that would shake the world. Santa Fe officers entered the home, and what they found defied every assumption a tragedy is supposed to follow. Betsy Arakawa, 65 years old, was found dead in a bathroom near the mudroom, a telephone and a bottle of medication beside her. The dog, Zinna, was dead in a kennel in the bathroom closet. And in the mudroom, near the back door, wearing sunglasses and a blue windbreaker, collapsed on the floor, was Gene Hackman, 95. His pacemaker, which had recorded his heartbeat, would give the investigators the crucial facts. There were no signs of a break-in, no violence, and no struggle. The front door was unlocked and slightly ajar, and nothing in that house explained what had happened. Two people, one of the most famous actors in history and his wife, died in the same home, days apart, in a mystery so unusual that it took the state's finest medical examiners months to answer a single brutal question. What really happened? The months of investigation uncovered a tragedy that was almost unbearably human. Betsy had died first of a rare and virulent illness spread by rodents. In her last days, she had been sick, calling for help, searching her phone, and asking about flu-like symptoms and breathing. She died on or around February 11th. And Gene, in the advanced stages of a disease that had been taking away his mind, died about a week later, alone in the house, likely unaware his wife was already gone. The cause was heart disease, worsened by the disease that had been eroding his memories and his routine. His body showed he had not been properly fed for some time. The clinical detail of a man who, in the fog of his illness and the silence of the house, had lost the thread that bound him to the world. The greatest of his generation, the symbol of American toughness, died alone in the mudroom of his own home, collapsed near the back door, days after the woman who had stood beside him for 3 decades had slipped away in another room. His own pacemaker recorded his final heartbeat. Was there anything that could have been done? Has anyone known? Was there a moment in that lonely week when the woman who had spent her life protecting him realized she could not, and the man who had spent his life becoming somebody realized he could no longer remember who he was? The investigators recreated the timeline, read the medical records, and delivered an official verdict. But the truth of those last days is not entirely in any document. It is in the unbearable image of 2 people who built their whole lives around privacy, dying in it, alone. Now here is the part of this story that no one expected, and it begins with a number: $80 million. Because Hackman, it turned out, had quietly amassed a fortune. Estimates put his net worth at around $80 million at his death, built on 4 decades of work and disciplined living. He lived modestly for a man of his scale. No mansion in Malibu, no private jets, no show. He bought his Santa Fe home and lived carefully. But when a man dies, the fortune he kept private becomes a public matter. In his will, he had left everything to Betsy. His wife of 3 decades was to receive every dollar. The will had been signed years before, and it did not mention his 3 children by name, not because he had forgotten them, but because his life with that first family had receded into distance. That set the stage for a legal drama the state had rarely seen, because Betsy had a clause in her own will she never expected to trigger. It said that if she and her husband died within a short period of each other, their estates would be handled as if they had passed at the same time, and her portion would go to a list of charitable causes. She died about a week before he did. The timing was everything. And because Gene died after his wife, his children, the ones not named in the will, found themselves in a fight over the $80 million. It played out in the courts, before the probate judges of Santa Fe, while the world watched. In the middle of it all was a personal representative, a close associate of Hackman's, caught between the charitable clause, the claims of the children, and the letter of the law. The state of New Mexico had to decide the fate of a fortune a man had never, for a moment, wanted known. Think about this. Have you ever watched money become the cruelest test of everything a family believes about love? Hackman spent his life running from fame, and it was his money, his $80 million, that dragged his name back into the most public scrutiny of his entire career after he was no longer alive to shut the door. The man who built a fortress of privacy could not stop his fortune from being watched. When the world found the quiet house, it could not look away from the money. But here is the lesson underneath the fortune, the one no autopsy report will tell you. Every dollar of that $80 million, every Oscar, every screen performance cannot tell you what really happened to Gene Hackman in his final weeks. The money cannot answer the crueler question, which is not who inherits, but what the man himself knew and felt in the silence of that house after the only person he trusted had already left. He did not die as a star. He died as a man, one who had outlived his time, his memory, and most of the people he loved. He had been raised by abandonment, and he spent his life refusing to be the one who left. And it was not the role he played that finally claimed him, but the raw, unequal weight of a body and mind worn down by the years. The true tragedy is not that he died, because we all die. It is that a man of such honesty had to leave the world in the most ordinary, quiet, devastating way a life can end, in a house full of silence, holding the door, waiting for someone who was no longer there. What does this story ask of you? Have you ever built a wall so carefully, around a family, a fortune, or a life, that you lost track of what the wall was for? In the end, it is not how much you made, or how famous you were, or whether your name was in the will. What survives, what money cannot buy, and what fame cannot protect is the way you treated the people beside you, and the way you were treated when you could no longer hold the door for yourself. Hackman gave the world one of the greatest bodies of work any actor has produced, and his last lesson was not in a film. It was in the way he fell. Even the strongest among us is still, in the end, a person, with a heart that can stop and a mind that can go, and a need as old and simple as any of us, not to be alone when it does. If this story moved you, leave a like as a tribute to a man who was one of the greatest the craft ever saw. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter. And tell us in the comments the one relationship, the one moment, you refuse to let your work or your fortune turn you away from. Because Hackman taught us, without ever saying a word, that the fortune you can keep is the one you can spend on the people you love while there is still time. Build it. Just don't build it so high that no one can reach you anymore.